350 articles and book reviews. He's a regular contributor to the Balkanization blog, editors. He's the author of 4 books: Constitutional Faith, Written in Stone, Public Monuments and Changing Societies, Wrestling with Diversity, and most recently, Our Undemocratic Constitution, Where the Constitution Goes Wrong and How We the People Can Correct It. But I'm actually wrong in saying he's the author of those 4 books, because in addition, these are only the single authored books. He's also the author of a case book, a series of edited books, co-authored books. I could go on, but you feel bad enough already. But what's really compelling about Sandy's work is not how very much of it there is, but the character of that work. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. The title of 2 articles, Being Embarrassed and the Danger of the 2 qualities that for me most characterize Sandy's work. A certain sense of playfulness and also a ruthlessly clear-sighted attack on the issues. So they are the work of a ruthless intellect that is in love with the question itself, and they are both a wild adventure and very brave. So it's a particularly great pleasure to bring Sandy here. Our commentators this year will be our own Rick Beeman, the John Walsh Centennial. We have 2 centennial professors. The John Walsh Centennial Professor of History here at the University of Pennsylvania, and the author of many books on the American Revolution and the early American Republic. I think this pairing is particularly interesting because of the sort of contrast of temporalities between the commentator and the author. But I hope you'll join me in welcoming Sandy.
Thank you very much. To be here, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming. I have to say, actually, there is one new book, and it's relevant to the discussion. Last year, Oxford published a book called Framed: America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance. And both the book and the title are relevant with regard to the earlier book that Anne mentioned, that is Our Undemocratic Constitution, Where the Constitution Goes Wrong and How We the People Can Correct It. The earlier book, which was published in 2006, did make the argument, which I certainly continue to believe, in fact, more vehemently than ever, that under no 21st century definition of democracy can the United States Constitution be called democratic. I'm willing to accept the view of Akhil Amar and other people that in 18th century terms the United States Constitution was gloriously democratic, but the point of much of my work is that we no longer live in the 18th century, and that in terms of the 20th century, it just doesn't fit the bill. One of the points I make in the new book, and one of the reasons the new book talks about America's 51 constitutions, is that among my latest hobby horses is the malpractice that the Legal Academy commits, and it may be even many political scientists in teaching the view that there's really only one Constitution in the United States. That's the one certainly we obsess about in law school, and one can graduate from our nation's finest law schools without ever having it brought to one's attention that there are actually 51 constitutions in the United States. And if you simply assess the United States Constitution against any of the 50 state constitutions, you discover that the United States Constitution is the most undemocratic of the 51 constitutions in the United States, not least because most of the state constitutions, not all of them, the Massachusetts Constitution goes back to 1780, but most American constitutions were written after 1787. In fact, each state has had an average of close to 3 constitutions. States are much more willing to imagine and indeed to act out a critique of their current constitution and not only amend the constitution they've got, but indeed to supplant it with a brand new constitution. The New Jersey Constitution, for example, was approximately 1948. One of my views, and I'll be interested in Rick Beeman's views of this, is that the United States Constitution was proposed and ratified perhaps in the very last historical moment when such an undemocratic constitution could have successfully been proposed and ratified. By the early 1820s, early 1800s, and certainly the 1820s and the like, when you see huge bursts of constitutional creativity, you discover far more democratic constitutions, including, for example, the 1846 New York Constitution, which was extraordinarily influential because it established the American principle, for better and for worse, that the right way to select judges is to elect them and not to let the governor appoint cronies who will basically see their function as rubber stamping what the governor wants to do, or the governor and his friends in the legislature. So in any event, that is one of the points of the new book. But what I discovered with regard to the response to the earlier book, where I answer my parenthetical, how we can correct it, call a new constitutional convention, and really assess the adequacy of the 1787 Constitution, the unchanged parts of the 1787 Constitution, which are the ones I'm most interested in. One of my other hobby horses with regard to professional malpractice in elite legal academies is that not only do we teach only about the United States Constitution, but we also teach basically exclusively what I have taken to calling the Constitution of Conversation. That is, the parts of the Constitution that are litigated and that are invitations to endless conversations about meaning, about interpretation, stuff like that. Think of the Equal Protection Clause. I am now relatively uninterested in the Constitution of Conversation, not because it isn't interesting, but because I think that quite literally more than enough has been written and said about it, and I certainly have no marginally useful contribution to make. There is another constitution that I've taken to calling the Constitution of Settlement, dealing with the dull and boring stuff that is taught, if at all, in high school civics courses, about the institutions that actually structure our political practices and that are in fact never litigated, because there's nothing except in very, very high theory seminars, there are no questions of interpretation. My favorite example is Inauguration Day, which is January 20th, and we know it's January 20th because that's what the 20th Amendment says. I happen to believe that it's really, really stupid in the 21st century to wait until January 20th to inaugurate a new president who has, by stipulation, beaten an incumbent on grounds that the incumbent deserves to be removed from office. One of my favorite amendments is the 20th Amendment, precisely because it moved Inauguration Day from March 4th to January 20th. There were giants in 1933 who actually could think about dull and boring structural issues and realized that it was not a good idea that the United States did not have a functioning government between November and March of 1932 and 1933, any more than it was a good idea that we didn't have a functioning government between November 1860 and March 1861. This is not the way a serious country organizes its polity. And these are the parts of the Constitution I'm now most interested in. That being said, what I discovered with regard to the response to the first book is that most people really don't care whether the United States Constitution is democratic or not. Many will tell me, either condescendingly or not, don't I realize that the United States Constitution wasn't meant to be democratic? We have a republic, not a democracy, and let's keep it that way. The people who say that do not know, I'm quite confident, that they're simply quoting the motto of the John Birch Society. But it was good marketing by Robert Welch in the early 60s to say that, because I think millions and millions of Americans across the political spectrum really do take seriously as a slogan. It's not that they thought deeply about it, but that they know that there is something called a Republican form of government, and that's really what we're committed to, and we were never intended to be a democracy. And that's one of the reasons I find it interesting to compare the United States Constitution with state constitutions, because at the very least you would think that if we, the people, really were committed to the kind of polity established in the United States Constitution, that American state constitutions would look very, very different from the way they do. And it's not merely the crazy West Coast constitutions like California, Oregon, and Washington with all of this dangerous direct democracy, but even dull and boring states like Maine that I've become a big fan of, which allows the electorate to engage in what I've taken to call citizen review if they have questions about legislation passed by the Maine legislature, signed by the Maine government. And in the last 3 years, they've exercised this twice. Once in a way that I really was disappointed at, the other in a way that I applauded, but obviously no political system is going to produce only results that one likes. But as I say, a very significant response was, so what, that it's not very democratic. I also have to say that most of my friends and family, and I can only imagine what those who are not my friends and family thought, were appalled by the suggestion that we should have a new constitutional convention, not necessarily because they weren't persuaded by my arguments that there are defects in the 1787 Constitution that we would be better off without, beginning with Inauguration Day. Inauguration Day certainly isn't the most important defect, but it's the easiest to grasp. And there is even the precedent of the 20th Amendment to indicate that people are capable of thinking about such a humdrum issue and doing something about it. But what really appalled most people about my argument was that I actually wanted a constitutional convention and thought that it would not be an unmitigated disaster. And I've come to the conclusion that most people I know, and given that, it's no huge secret in terms of academic sociology, that most people I know, most of my friends and family, would be somewhere on the left rather than right. And I think it is a truth of contemporary American politics that the left is scared stiff of democratic politics. If you see any embrace of democratic politics, it's much more likely to come with the Tea Party and some of the right-wing populist movements, and not in the left. But in any event, that's the short history of the earlier book, which turned out in a way that I didn't realize at the time was really a book in applied political theory. I continue to be interested,